Well, last week we began our study of Ezra with an overview of the historical period and the contents of the book. The book was written by the scribe and priest Ezra, and he was a direct descendant of Aaron, so he was in that priestly line. It was written during the time of the Persian Empire, just after Persia conquered Babylon. The Hebrew Bible combines Ezra and Nehemiah into one book, and so this leads many people to believe that Ezra wrote both of these books, and he may also have written 1st and 2nd Chronicles because there's kind of a similar historical style there. Well, Ezra is divided into two major sections. The first 6 chapters deal with the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, which was led by Zerubbabel. This is the first of 3 returning trips that the exiles, the Jewish exiles, made from Jerusalem, from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And then the second part, chapters 7 through 10, deal with, I guess I added a chapter there, didn't I? There's 7 through 10, deal with the second return of the Jews, and it really focuses on the spiritual rebuilding of the people. There are no miracles recorded in Ezra, but instead we see God ruling over earthly kings and rulers with quiet power. Well, then we considered a timeline of kings and events, and we talked about the different Persian kings and when they reigned, and these people are mentioned in other books of the Bible, and they're also mentioned throughout history. We've got a good historical record of them, and we know really pretty accurately when they reigned and some of the events that happened during their reign. Well, then we talked about some of the layout of the Bible books. We said that Ezra is actually, these two sections of Ezra are actually separated by almost 60 years. And then after that, the book of Nehemiah was written, so there's a gap there. And then we also said that in between those first 2 parts of, or those 2 sections of Ezra, is when the book of Esther was written. So it kind of helped our thinking to fit that into place. And then we talked about a couple of other prophets that were prophesying this time. Haggai and Zechariah are during that period of the first portion of Ezra. And then we see Malachi, that last Old Testament prophet, overlapping with Nehemiah's time frame a little bit. And then we also mentioned a few other worldly characters who were living during that time. The Buddha, Confucius in China, and then Socrates was in Greece. So that was kind of our time frame for Ezra and beyond. We're kind of taking a look at this post-exile period in one swath there. Well, then we talked about the 3 major themes that we see in Ezra. The first one is that God alone is sovereign over all. And this pops up right in these first 4 verses that we're going to see tonight. God moves the hearts of his faithful servants, and he also moves the hearts of heathen kings who don't know him or acknowledge him. Tonight we're going to see that God stirs up the heart of Cyrus, and he also stirs up the heart of his people. Well, then secondly, we said that God's word is key to the success of any endeavor, and we'll see this particularly in Ezra 7 as we get there, where we see that Ezra had set his heart to study God's word, to practice it in daily obedience, and to share it with others. And this was the secret of all of his success, and it's as well for us, it's the cure for all of our failures in life as well. And then thirdly, we said that God is more gracious than we deserve, yet he's still a righteous and holy God to be feared. So just because he's more gracious doesn't mean that he doesn't care about righteousness or that he's some kind of a pushover. That's not the case at all. Yes, he's gracious, but he's also righteous and holy to be feared. He longs to show grace and mercy to his people, but he will not suffer our willing disobedience forever. And then finally, we talked about 4 reasons why the book of Ezra is important. First of all, it records the history of Israel. So our Christian faith is rooted in history. It speaks of real places and real dates, real events, real people. And Ezra provides some historical continuity in this flow of the story. It's a link in the chain of the story of the Jewish people. It's part of the unvarnished record of God's interaction with his people. And then secondly, it's important because it shows that God keeps his promises. God promised his people that he would return them to the land he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob after they were in exile for 70 years. He's faithful to his covenant. Ezra's account of events show us that God keeps his word and blesses those who remain faithful to him. And thirdly, we said that it shows the messianic promise is still alive. This is related to the second point. But here God is fulfilling his promise to David to keep his descendants alive, to keep someone on the throne. Ezra maintains the records that point to Messiah. And then fourthly, it provides guidance for believers. It shows God's people encountering opposition and how they overcame it through God's provision. Well, tonight we'll look at the proclamation that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. So let's take a look at the first chapter of Ezra. And as always, if you jot down any important words or phrases, we'll write them down as our overview for tonight. So Ezra chapter 1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. And let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of Yahweh that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver and gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of Yahweh that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. Okay, so what are some of our theme words there?
First year of Cyrus.
Rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. Silver and gold.
The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus.
Fulfill.
When the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem.
I'm sorry, when the, say it again.
The last line in the chapter.
Oh, Okay. Great. Well, we noted briefly last week that there are some similarities between Ezra and the way Second Chronicles ends. So while we're looking here at these first verses in Ezra, somebody has Second Chronicles 36:22, and if they'd read that as we kind of keep our eye here on Ezra, the first verses.
Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all the kingdom and also put it in writing.
Just to,
Verse 23.
Yeah.
Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up.
so there through the middle of verse 3, they're pretty much identical writing at the end of Second Chronicles and here at the beginning of Ezra. So that's our overlap, and it also is one thing that causes some people to think that maybe these books were written by the same person. Well, in verse 1, we read that the decree was issued in the first year of Cyrus. So this really is the first year after his conquest of Babylon in October of 539. So that means the decree is being issued in 538 BC. And you'll recall from our study in Daniel that the Persians conquered Babylon by diverting the Euphrates River so they could sneak in under the wall of the city. And this happened during that night when King Belshazzar of Babylon and all of his court and his friends were at this banquet getting drunk, and the hand came out and wrote on the wall. So that's the time when the Persians came and took over. Well, this decree was issued around 538 BC, but Cyrus had already been a king for almost 20 years at that point. He first was the king of Ashan, and that's kind of in the middle of this map here. So you can see where Elam is. That's an older name for this area. You can see just north of Elam. Let me magnify this a little bit. You can see north of Elam is Susa, and we've talked about Susa before. Daniel was there, and we're gonna see that again come up in our study. But Anshan was the older capital, and that's where Cyrus began and took over from his father, the king. And then he was really expanded that and kind of solidified some of that Median Empire and eventually the Medo-Persian Empire. So he was king there. Around 550, then he becomes the king of Medo-Persia, and then he conquers Babylon, and he's given the title King of Babylon. So the first year of Cyrus is really the first year after he has conquered Babylon. And that title, King of Babylon, was considered an honor at that time, and so he added that onto his repertoire of titles. God identified Cyrus by name to the prophet Isaiah. And so somebody has Isaiah 44, 28, and 45, 1. So it's the last verse of chapter 44 and the first verse of 45.
The Lord the Redeemer, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and as a temple, your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed.
So God gave the name Cyrus to Isaiah. This happened 150 years before Cyrus was even born, that he was identified to the prophet Isaiah. Well, this happened that the word of Yahweh given through the mouth of Jeremiah the prophet would be fulfilled. And we see this in Jeremiah 25, 11 through 14.
This land shall become ruin and waste, and these nations shall serve the Lord, serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation and the land of the Chaldeans for their iniquity, declares Yahweh, making the land an everlasting waste. I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it, everything written in this book, which Jeremiah prophesied against all the nations. For many nations and great kings shall make slaves even of them, and I will recompense them according to their deed and the work of their hands.
I think we've seen this scripture before, but we're taking it again tonight as just kind of a review. This was the prophecy that the Lord gave to Jeremiah, and there are really two parts of it. One part is the deliverance of the Jews out of their exile, but the second part of it is the punishment of Babylon. So God's fulfilling this promise to return the Jews after 70 years, and he's also punishing Babylon for her sins. Babylon would feel the yoke of captivity and slavery for the evil that she did to Jeremiah, that she did to Judah. And Jeremiah chapter 51 goes into a lot more detail about the destruction of Babylon. And some of this is prophetic language. It talks about the end times, but there's some selected verses we're going to pick out of chapter 51 to get a feel for this punishment that God is going to be bringing on to Babylon, largely through the Persians, but others as well. So if we want to read these verses, we're going to take a look at verses 1, 2, 5, 11, and 24, just kind of a sample of what chapter 51 is like.
Thus says the Lord, behold, I will stir up the spirit of a destroyer against Babylon, against the inhabitants of Leb-Kamai, and I will send to Babylon winnowers, and they shall winnow her, and they shall empty her land, when they come against her from every side on the day of trouble. For Israel and Judah have not been forsaken by their God, Yahweh, but the land of the Chaldeans is full of guilt against the Holy One of Israel. Sharpen the arrows, take up the shields. The Lord has stirred up the spirit of the king of the Medes, because his purpose concerning Babylon is to destroy it. For that is the vengeance of Yahweh, the vengeance for his temple.
So the prophets would sometimes ask God, why are you using this evil Babylon to punish us? And God comes back and says, don't worry about that. They're going to have their day too. And so these are some of the prophecies related to that. So Jeremiah's words here are important. They make clear that it's Yahweh who is moving the hearts of kings. It's significant because we read elsewhere that Cyrus credited his god Marduk for ordering him to march on Babylon. And Jeremiah is setting the record straight here. Well, God stirred up the heart of Cyrus to issue a proclamation, and he says he put it in writing as well. It was distributed far and wide so that all would know. We'll read later in Ezra that King Darius found a copy of this decree stored in the citadel city of Ecbatana. It was a policy of Cyrus to allow the people to return to their homelands. So as he captured the lands, he was a little bit different in his approach than what Nebuchadnezzar did. Nebuchadnezzar would capture them and bring them, take them away from their land as captives. Cyrus would allow them to go back and return. And part of his reason was he wanted them to go back and take their gods with them so that their gods would pray for him to his god, Bel and Nebo. Bel's another name for Marduk, and Nebo was his son. So that's part of Cyrus's motive here in allowing this repatriation and this religious tolerance was he wanted them to pray to his gods. But he also has some political motives here. He's creating some buffer states around him in his empire that would be loyal to him. We see evidence of this written on what is known as the Cyrus cylinder. It's a clay artifact that was discovered in Babylon, actually. It was unearthed in the year 1879 by an excavation team from the British Museum, and that's where it resides right now. The Cyrus cylinder records the conquest of Babylon and Cyrus's program of religious tolerance and repatriating people to their homelands. One statement on the cylinder reads, "May all the gods whom I have resettled in their sacred cities daily ask Bel and Nebo for a long life for me." So we get there his motivation in allowing the people to return.
So that, the writing is on the outside there?
Yeah, that's cuneiform writing on the outside of the cylinder. Let me see if I make it larger, if that helps any.
How big that is?
I think it's about, a foot or so in length. And you can maybe make out some of the cuneiform there. That's not decorative, that's writing.
I know, I was trying to
Must
figure
have
out.
been very painstaking for you to do that.
Oh,
Chicken scratch, that's.
Oh,
yeah,
goodness.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like a little like stylus, literally, it's
That must have
carving.
been a lifetime almost for somebody to do that.
So Persia is ruled by this authoritarian king, but still it did allow some expressions of religious freedom and tolerance when it was to their political advantage. So it was a way to keep the people in line and gain their support. And even though the Persians' religious tolerance was not just altruistic, they had their own motives, some of these ideas did have an influence on future political thinkers, and it's said that even Thomas Jefferson was influenced by some of these ideas of tolerance that the Persians had.
That bit of clay, like time was against their side. Because they had to finish writing before they hardened up, right? Unless they had to feel a soft, like, feel a voice in it.
Yeah. Well, note in verse 2 that Cyrus called God by his name, Yahweh. Now, this isn't to suggest that he's a follower of the true God, but simply that it was common to call these different gods by their name. One reason why Moses said, if the people want to know your name, what am I going to tell them? So Cyrus here credits Yahweh with giving him all the kingdoms of earth, but these are just words from a polytheistic king. He believes in a lot of gods. We read that Cyrus really doesn't know God, and Isaiah tells us this in Isaiah 45, verses 4 and 5.
For the sake of my servant Jacob, and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me.
So those words, in the verses before that, it mentions Cyrus's name. So speaking of Cyrus, God says, I knew you, I named you, but you didn't know me. So Cyrus issued the proclamation, but it wasn't the decision of a king, really. It's a divinely inspired action. He acknowledges that God has charged him to build a house in Jerusalem. The historian Josephus later wrote that these prophecies of Isaiah were shown to Cyrus, and an earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was so written. So isn't that interesting? Somebody showed these things to Cyrus, and he said, okay, I want to fulfill that. I want to do that. Cyrus thinks he is using God, but God is using him. He also calls Yahweh the God of heaven. This phrase occurs 9 times in Ezra and 10 times in some of the post-exilic books of Nehemiah and Daniel. It's used rarely in other Old Testament books, but it speaks to God's sovereignty. Cyrus reigns over a vast realm, but Yahweh is greater because he rules from heaven. Again, this is not Cyrus acknowledging the sovereignty of Yahweh necessarily. At the end of verse 4, he also says he is the God who is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus, like a lot of these other kings of the time, they see their God as having a territory or a place of residence. And so Cyrus sees the God of Israel as a territorial God, just like those of the other nations. Well, in verse 3, Cyrus gives permission to any Jew to join the effort to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. But really, as we read that, it's more than just permission. He's encouraging them to go. He wants them to reestablish a community in Jerusalem and build a temple. So these words, go up, build, and house, become a recurring theme in the first 6 chapters of Ezra. We see it here for the first time. It's the story of the people going up to build the house of God. Well, verse 4 is remarkable in that Cyrus calls on the neighbors of those who return to give of their means to support the effort. I put him Cyrus the fundraiser. That may be a bit of a stretch, but he does encourage people to give to the effort that's going on. They were to give gold and silver. They were to give goods and beasts. They were to give free will offerings for the temple that could be used once the people got back to Jerusalem. Now, this journey is going to be 4 to 6 months for them to make the trek from where they are in Babylon back to Jerusalem, because they can't go straight across. They've got to go up and around to avoid the desert. So these offerings would supply the returning exiles on their journey, and it also helped to fund the construction work of rebuilding the temple. Now, these words just are so favorable toward the Jews. You might think that a Jew dictated it and gave it to him. And in fact, some people think maybe Daniel wrote this and stuck it under the king's face for his signature. And of course, you know, it's customary practice then, as it is now. Advisors and aides write decrees and speeches and put them before a king or a president for his approval and signature. I mean, you don't think all these documents the president's signing that he's written? Of course not. We know that somebody's prepared them. And so in that day. So I think it's likely that somebody prepared this and put it under his hand for signature. We don't get the details, but it's so specific and generous that it seems like there's Jewish origins in it. Well, Ezra is also showing us that he regards this as a second Exodus. God is again delivering his people from captivity in a foreign land and returning them to the promised land. In the first Exodus, God used Moses and Joshua to lead the people. In the second Exodus, he used Ezra, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah to lead the people out. God is again making provision for their journey by way of the gifts of neighbors and enemies both. We see this in Exodus. So we're going to read first where the command is given to the people in Exodus 3, and then the fulfillment of it in Exodus 12. So let's look at those verses.
But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that will let you go. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. And every woman shall ask of her neighbor, and the woman who lives in her house, articles of silver and gold and cloth and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians.
So that was the instruction to the people to what they should do and the way in which they were going to plunder the Egyptians. And then in chapter 12, we see the result.
The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We will all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls, bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians.
So we do see some similarities in these two Exodus journeys. Coming out of Egypt, there were all the plagues that were devastating Egypt. As they're coming out of Babylon, Babylon is actually conquered and laid low before the people come out. In the first exodus out of Egypt, we see that they asked their neighbors, the Egyptians, for gold and silver and goods, and they give them. Good riddance, we're glad to get rid of you. And here, coming out of Babylon, they're actually taking this gold and silver from both fellow Jews who are not going to make the journey but want to help fund it, but also from other Persians who are living in that land. The people had been in bondage in Babylon because they failed to keep their covenant obligations that God gave them through Moses during that first Exodus. God is miraculously working again in the life of the nation of Israel. Dr. Constable said, God does not discard what he has chosen, but he remakes it when it fails. Well, the religious leaders, the priests and Levites, and the heads of households of Judah and Benjamin would spearhead this effort to return and rebuild the temple. These are the two tribes that were taken captive into Babylon. They were the tribes that made up the nation of Judah. Well, let's make one footnote about the other 10 tribes that made up the nation of Israel. These 10 tribes of Israel were conquered by the Assyrians and dispersed around 722 BC, so over 100 years before Babylon conquered Judah. Not much is known about them, so they're sometimes referred to as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Most of them were deported to Assyria, and many of them intermarried with the people of other heathen nations. Some reunited with the two remaining tribes in Judah. They went back to Judah. And so any of those that chose to go back to Judah, they would have been part of the people that got deported to Babylon along with Judah. The decree of Cyrus went out to all the kingdoms, so it may be that at some point some of the other tribes, the people from the other tribes, heard this and made their way back to Israel too. Well, we don't know much about the 10 tribes, but we can say they're not lost. Luke tells us that the prophetess Anna was of the tribe of Asher. Jesus promises the disciples that they will sit on the thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. In Luke 22, we read that. James, in his book, writes to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. And John speaks in Revelation of the 12,000 witnesses from each of the 12 tribes. So we may not have all the answers, but these tribes are not lost as far as God's concerned. God stirred up the spirits of the people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So first we saw God stir up the heart of the heathen king Cyrus, and now he's going to stir up the hearts of his people. God stirred up the spirits of the people, but as we'll see next time, only a small number responded. Many did not respond to the call. They had become comfortable where they were. This is a lesson for us to be sensitive to the call of the Holy Spirit on our lives. Paul warns us against this in his letters. In Ephesians 4:30, then in 1 Thessalonians, we have warnings about this complacency.
Ephesians 4:30. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. 1 Thessalonians 5:19. Do not quench the Spirit.
So, reminders to us to be sensitive to the Spirit's call in our lives. Fellow Jews freely donated money to the journey and the rebuilding effort. They gave silver and gold to fund the effort and to help them get established once they reached their destination. They gave animals and the supplies that were needed for this 4 to 6 month trip back to the homeland. Verse 6 says, all those around them, so we can assume that their Gentile neighbors also contributed to the effort. Well, let's try to put ourselves back in that time, and maybe we can have a little discussion around this question. If we think about those exiles back then, what were some of the practical considerations that they had to consider as they were making their decision to return or not.
How are they going to sustain their efforts, and how are they going to fund it? It's short of the business, I mean, most people won't do it. And they have savings for a month or whatever, day to day.
Yeah.
But clearly, the undercurrent is that everybody else, including the Gentiles, must have thought that there was something of merit, meaning that this was worthwhile to donate their money to.
Mhm.
Right? I don't think I'd give my money to anybody that I thought was just going to roam the earth and do nothing.
We call kids.
Probably had to consider their age,
Yep.
their health,
Yep.
probably even their comfort. They have been there a long time, life's pretty comfortable now. Babylonians are out of the way.
Yeah.
Daniel's still here. Why would we leave him?
Yeah.
He's the boss.
Yeah.
A lot of insights they would have
Yeah.
to think about.
It's 2 generations, so they've even built some roots and careers maybe well off.
Yeah, God told them, God said, yeah, go and give your children in marriage, plant your vineyards, pray for the nation, the city that you're in. And they did that and got comfortable doing that. Yeah.
Just got a new house.
Yeah, for some of them, maybe they have to leave family behind. Maybe they leave parents behind because they can't make the journey, or they leave other family members behind. Yeah.
There might have even been dissension within the family about staying or going.
Sure.
I mean, not all, the Bible specifically says, not all Israel is Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. Verse 7 tells us that Cyrus brought out the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple when he conquered Jerusalem. Well, at that time in the ancient Near East, when an army went to war, they would sometimes carry an image of their god into battle to help secure victory. We've got an example of this in 1 Chronicles, where David conquered the Philistines at Baal Perazim. So somebody has 1 Chronicles 14. We'll take a look at that description.
And David inquired of God, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to him, go up, and I will give them into your hand. And he went to Baal Perazim, and David struck them down there. And David said, God has broken through my enemies by my hand, like a bursting flood. Therefore, the name of this place is called Baal Perazim.
So the victorious army then would take these idols or these images of the gods of the country they just defeated, and they take them away and lock them up. And this was a demonstration to all that these gods were inferior to their gods, and they were impotent in the face of this victorious army. Well, of course, the Israelites had no images of their God, because God commanded them to make no graven images in the second commandment in Exodus 20. So it seems that was the reason why Nebuchadnezzar took all these utensils out of the temple. There's no idol to take, so he's going to do the next best thing. He's going to grab these utensils, and he carries them off to the temple of his God in Babylon. So to him, they represented the power of the God of Israel. In the eyes of the Persians, this restoring of the gods of Israel to their rightful place in Jerusalem gives them power again. So Cyrus says, here, go ahead and take all these utensils back and put them into Jerusalem when you get there. So now they're going to be restored to their city because, again, they think God is a territorial God. So they're going to put Yahweh back in his city, and that'll represent him now returning to his home, and he will be able to pray to Cyrus's gods on his behalf. That's their mindset. It's interesting here that in all of this, there's no mention of the Ark of the Covenant. And that seems a little strange to me because that seems like kind of their most prized possession in a way, maybe their most important artifact. There's no evidence that the Babylonians took it with them to Babylon, nor that the Jews later returned with it. We can't say with any certainty what happened to it. Josephus wrote that it was not in the Second Temple, and we know there's no mention of it in Jesus' day. Most scholars think that it was probably destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar when he destroyed the temple, but we can't say for sure. Pretty sure Indiana Jones didn't find it. Well, King Cyrus has his treasurer, Mithridath, remove the items from the house of Cyrus's god. He counted out the vessels and turned them over to Sheshbazzar. So Sheshbazzar here is described as a prince of Judah. So who is this Sheshbazzar? Well, there are a few different theories about who Sheshbazzar is. First, some say that this is just another name for Zerubbabel. This doesn't seem likely, to me at least, that a Jew would be assigned two different Persian names. So I think probably that's not a good answer. Secondly, some say that it was a Jew who was appointed to oversee the work initially, and that he died shortly thereafter, and Zerubbabel took over the work. We don't have any evidence to support this, so I don't lean that way either. The third theory, I think, is the one that's maybe the most likely. The third theory is that Sheshbazzar was Zerubbabel's uncle. And this view holds that Sheshbazzar is an alternate spelling of Shenazar, who's mentioned as a son of Jeconiah in 1 Chronicles. Now, Bill's going to attempt to read this for us.
I'll read it.
There are a lot of crazy names, but what I want you to listen for is there is the name of Shenazar, who we think is a version of Sheshbazzar. You're going to hear Jeconiah, who was the last king before the exile, and you'll hear Zerubbabel in there too. So with that, go for it.
The descendants of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah his son, Zedekiah his son, and the sons of Jeconiah, the captain, Shealtiel his son, Malachiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechemiah, Hosham, Nebadiah, the sons of Pedaiah. Well, that's it. 3.
So the kingly line flowed from Jeconiah, the last king at the time of the exile, through his son Pedaiah to his son Zerubbabel. Well, Pedaiah had a brother named Shenazar. And so we think that Sheshbazzar is just a variation of that, and that makes him Zerubbabel's uncle. So this is the explanation I like. I think it makes the most sense, but again, we can't say with any certainty here. It seems to also fit that he would be called a prince of Judah, because that would be an appropriate title for him. So I think it's probably the most likely explanation.
He may not have been anybody.
He may not have been anybody, yeah.
Think about it. God trusted him with the wealth of the nation and just put his name in the scripture, just record it, memorialize his name.
Yep.
Whoever it was.
Explanation number 4, yeah. So Sheshbazzar begins the building effort, and at some later point, the work is picked up by Zerubbabel, who finishes the job. Well, verses 9 and 10 list the items that were brought out of the house of Cyrus's gods. They totaled 2,499. Verse 11 says the items given to Sheshbazzar totaled 5,400. This isn't a contradiction. The items listed in verses 9 and 10 are the larger, or the more important items that Ezra decides to call out here. It's not intended to be a complete inventory. And then verse 11 gives us the total count here. The preservation of the sacred temple vessels demonstrates blessings of God's grace. Well, when Ezra wrote this book, he was recording historical events, but he also had in mind his immediate readers, who would be the first to read the book. He wanted to encourage them in their temple worship. He wanted them to appreciate the effort that went into the project and to see God's hand in it. How miraculous it was that God stirred up the spirit of the king of Persia to allow them to return. Ezra wrote these words 2 or 3 generations after these events occurred. It would have been easy for the people who did not witness or experience the difficulties to forget all that God had done. He didn't want them to take for granted their ability to worship God in the temple. Well, we already see that Ezra is developing his themes and the reasons why we study this book. He makes it clear that God is sovereign over all, even powerful heathen kings. He records history and shows a promise-keeping God. The call to return went out to all. And we'll see next week that only a small number actually responded to this call. Well, I found one piece of art here. This is by our engraver, Gustav Dore. We featured him at other times here. And this is entitled, Cyrus Restores the Vessels of the Temple. So this is a depiction of Cyrus passing on those vessels. Let me try to make this a little bit larger here. We can see some of this. So there's Cyrus outside the temple of his God, and he is seeing that these different utensils are passed on to the Jews. So here he's trying to show the triumph of faith and restoration, because these things are going to be restored. The vessels are being returned. It's a demonstration of God's divine providence and the continuity of worship. They're going to take these back and and they're going to reestablish worship in the temple with these.
I find that very fascinating because, first of all, it says it's all gold and silver. And there's a lot of it. But I tell you, gold's $90 an ounce, or silver's $90 an ounce today in this country. That's a lot. But this is so significant, and one, because it's the wealth of the Jewish nation. Yet it was something that Cyrus was willing to let go. So he must have had a tremendous pile of wealth buried in his vault somewhere. I mean, you don't just give away you don't bankrupt your own nation.
Yeah. I think he also sees it as kind of their version of an idol, right? He thinks it's the closest thing they have to an idol, and that's the other part of it.
I think that was kind of a creative way for God to hide his goods so they could be used later.
It's also kind of a reminder of how much wealth they took out of Egypt. Because there's no record of gold mines in Jerusalem.
Wasn't it some of the stuff that they bought from the temple too?
Yeah, that's what this is. These are the utensils that were in the temple. So the different,
From the back?
plates and other, yeah.
Surprised
Yeah.
It's interesting if you parallel that to, World War II and the plundering that the Nazis and how much they took from the Jewish poor.
Yeah.
Artwork from all over.
Yeah, and then just kind of mirroring that to we created the sentiment for the treaties to allow them to reestablish Jerusalem. It's just kind of it's a odd sidebar, but then also to create that sentiment of everybody moved in the direction of hey, let's support everybody to go back to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about a few application questions here. What do we see tonight about God and his character in this first chapter of Ezra?
His plan's perfect. But he lays the seed. And
He was using Cyrus.
Yeah.
It was the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah, Cyrus thought it was the other way around, but yeah.
I think that that's ultimately like a fabric of faith, right? That continuity of, even though we think that evil powers are prevailing and things are kind of going sideways, is that if you continue to have faith and know that the plan is already been ordained, that, yeah,
Yeah.
nobody's manipulating Cyrus, right? Or whoever we think is in power.
Yeah. Well, a little different question here, a little more personal one maybe. What's something that I was praying for once and now I'm enjoying because I got an answer to that prayer, but maybe I'm taking it for granted?
I think that's human nature to do that. So every day we have to be reminded that we don't deserve anything, which we don't. I mean, you know.
I want to give an example where I was trying to connect with an old friend of mine because I just felt like there was a kindred spirit and that maybe there was something accretive as far as a relationship and that we could talk about things and prayed for him for a long, long time and in my own way, before I loved the Lord, and now we talk every single day. And it's just like, it's an odd thing. Like you don't even expect it and it's just there and you're just like, and we laugh about it, you know. And the same thing, it's reciprocated. It's that whole iron sharpens iron and, you know, fellowship. But I think that's the most, when you see that, you pray for that. And if you're willing and you're hearing and you're listening, it's everywhere.
And of course, the point is that we not take God's blessings for granted, that we remember them, unlike what we see the people here about to do. And then this can be a takeaway. We're over time, but think about this week. How can we encourage and support fellow believers who are embarking on a journey of restoration and rebuilding? We think about there are ways that we support missionaries as they go out, but what about broadening that idea out? Just people that are maybe in their personal lives needing some rebuilding and restoration. How can we come alongside them and encourage them in that journey that they're going on?